Hi there everyone, welcome to the first video for week 3. In this video, what we're going to try to do is to really focus on a theme that is commonly discussed when people bring up Descartes. And it's something that comes up primarily in the 6th meditation. So like in the last video, we got around to explaining some of the basics of Descartes' 2 arguments for the existence of God. However, we didn't really have the opportunity to dive that much into the specific philosophical problem that Descartes addresses around the 5th and 6th meditation. In that problem, Descartes believes is to explain the human condition. Right? That's rather ambitious, isn't it? Right? Descartes wants to explain how it is that if there's a God and if there's not an evil demon, it still happens to be the case that we get things wrong sometimes, right? So like one point of view that you might have about Descartes' demonstration that there's not an evil demon, right? You might say, okay, Descartes, you proved that there exists a God that is powerful in every way, right? And all good. Okay, great. And so that proves why there can't be an evil demon. However, haven't you proven too much? Why would an all-powerful God allow us to fall into error in any way, right? It seems like you've proven that this God is inconsistent with the existence of a certain kind of error, right? An error produced by an evil demon. But if there are really no limits to God's power, why would God create us as finite beings that are wrong at all, right? And so the sense of this argument is really to say that Descartes' proof has gone wrong in some way, right? That the God that he proved the existence of, his attempt to combat his own skepticism, sort of yields these absurd conclusions that no one else would agree with. And so Descartes' dualism, and we're going to discuss what exactly that means more in just a moment. Descartes' dualism is his attempt to explain himself on this phenomena. So Descartes believes, as he believes that he has proven in the 2nd meditation with the cogito argument, that the essence of our soul, of our very being, is that we are a thinking thing. He nonetheless also concedes, and it is true that he has an account of the fact that human beings are also embodied creatures, right? Like I'm not just a thinking thing, but I also have a body. I move around in the physical world. I push objects in the physical world, right? I participate in the physical world. I am embodied, right? That is an important dimension of the human condition that the cogito argument, it seems like, maybe gives Descartes reason to say is inessential or doesn't matter or, something to that effect. And this is usually how people criticize Descartes. They say, well, Descartes, he was 17th century thinker. He was obsessed with the existing tools at the time, which were mathematical in nature. And so that motivates his hatred of the body and his hatred of like empirical investigations into the world, right? And some people then say this Cartesian dualism then comes to be sort of at the root of a number of fundamental mistakes in Western philosophy. Sometimes this point of view is connected with like Western philosophy as a whole. Like Descartes is merely making explicit sort of like the cardinal sin, essentially, of Western philosophy, which is the belief that there are two fundamentally different kinds of things in the world: minds and bodies. And again, you can see why people think this. You can see the connection to a figure like Plato. For those of you who have not taken other philosophy classes, which I know some of you, Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher who believed that the body was a hindrance to the mind, right? So the body keeps us concerned in the here and now, in our immediate physical, situation, and concerned with our physical needs, and so on. And Plato considered all of this, a rather unfortunate distraction for our souls to be able to, work on their virtue and purify themselves. And so when Socrates, who's Plato's teacher, gets condemned to drink hemlock and die, hemlock is extremely poisonous and the death is rather gruesome, his response was essentially to say, "Oh, thank you so much. Thanks. Now I can finally get rid of this mortal coil." He says a cock to Asclepius. Asclepius was a healer. So he was like, "Oh, thank you for healing me by destroying my body." Essentially, right? And so people try to draw an analogy from Plato and Plato's hatred of the body in favor of the soul to Descartes' dualism. And there is something to this connection, right? I don't want to say that there's nothing to it at all, but what I do want to try to emphasize and make clear in both this lecture as well as the next ones, that what makes Descartes' reflection on this problem profoundly different is that, unlike Plato, Descartes is extremely impressed with the results of natural science. That Descartes was himself a scientist, that he was very interested in figuring out how the body works, and he has a theory of how bodies interact, and presents his own physical theory. And so I would suggest that Descartes does have an account of embodiment, and that Descartes' account of embodiment is in many ways eerily similar to the one that we have now, as contemporary, common sense. The Cartesian frame is still with us, even if it has certain kinds of fundamental problems that we want to think about and explore. And so that's really what we're going to do for this week, is we're going to discuss Descartes' dualism, especially as it emerges in the sixth meditation. We're going to think about really, why is this a fundamental problem? Because many philosophers will say, such and such views are essentially Cartesian, or they're dualistic. And that's meant to be enough to say, you should be done with them, that they've made a fundamental kind of mistake, and that, it needs no further discussion, and that we can essentially leave it in the waste bin of history. And the justification for being so curt about this is well, it's not a Descartes class, right? Okay, but this is a Descartes class, right? So we're going to discuss this idea in much more depth than it is typically discussed, and in general, try to give a little bit more of a charitable and sympathetic reading of Descartes. Because Descartes, as a thinker, he's become very important to us now in the Western tradition, but when Descartes was writing at the time, he had no idea how foundational or important his writings would be. He envisioned them as just a helpful guide for other random weirdos that would bother to read it. You know what I mean? And just to give an analogy, in a previous version of the meditations that he wrote, the Reguli, he describes that really what he's trying to do is he's just trying to help us out of certain problems. So for example, if you were to get lost in a forest, right, the most important thing that you do is go straight in one direction. Why? Because if you start, turning around, right, you're going to start going in circles in the forest and you're never going to make headway in any direction whatsoever, right? And Descartes thought this is the paradigm for what our knowledge is like most of the time, is we're just kind of going around in circles, essentially. We have no ability to orient ourselves, to check our way, right, to determine anything like that. And so the advice that Descartes gives is you need a method, right? You can't just be going around willy-nilly and expect to escape the forest. You need some sort of principled way that you're going to behave so that you can get out of this problem, right? And so if you go in a straight line, then you know that you're making progress in one way or another, right? You're at least not just stuck in the same place over and over again. And so Cartesian philosophy, like, more than being obsessed with like first principles or like I'm gonna determine how everyone else does everything or something like that, Descartes envisioned himself as a navigator, right? As somebody who, in a forest of uncertainty and doubt, wanted to help orient us to find a way, right? That's really all that Descartes is concerned with the cogito, the Archimedean point. Just like you can use like the North Star to orient yourself in a situation where you're lost like that, right? And then once you're oriented, you can just go in a single direction. So too, that's how Descartes envisions his own philosophy. And so really, the basis of Descartes' dualism is not overly Christianized beliefs about like hatred of the body or something to that effect, although there are certain resonances there. It really comes from this ethos, this attitude of being an explorer. And so I want to try for us to think about Cartesian dualism in that kind of way, right? Rather than just thinking about it as an elementary mistake. But okay, so we've talked a lot about how other people talk about Cartesian dualism. Let's talk more about like what it is, right? So Descartes believes that there are two fundamentally different kinds of things in the world. There are two fundamentally different kinds of things because they have different essences, right? So the essence, the nature of that thing, they are different from one another. And so this is what makes him a dualist, right? The belief there are two fundamentally different kinds of substances, namely minds and bodies, right? Things that exist in the physical world, things that do not exist in a physical world. And so let's describe the essence of that more. So the top just says Cartesian dualism. There's a little chart here. We have two columns and 4 rows. So the first column is mind. So we're going to think about these are the features of minded substance, right? And on the other side, we're going to think about bodies, right? These are the features of extended substance. So thinking substance. This is, Descartes believes, what he discovered from the cogito, right? So I think, therefore I am. So even if I'm sleeping, even if everything that I imagine is not how it seems, right? I can be certain, absolutely certain, in a way that is beyond doubt, that I am a thinking thing. And why can I have that certainty? Well, I can know I'm a thinking thing because I am a thinking thing, right? It's an immediate kind of knowledge because it comes from my very identity, my essence of myself, right? Any of the attitudes that I have, right, are for Descartes modifications of thinking. So, like, whenever I perceive something, right, in the world, Descartes thinks, well, what you're doing is you're thinking it, right? You're perceiving it, but you're perceiving it in an unclear way, right? And so thinking just refers to all of our mental activities, right? Even perceiving, even deciding to do stuff, that's all thinking. Because thinking is the essential nature of this kind of substance, right? In the Meditations, Descartes says, you know, the thing that thinks or judges or wills or whatever, right? And so it's that thing that I can't doubt that I am, right? But also, from the cogito argument, I discover that there are various features about myself that I can doubt. Namely, I can doubt everything about my body, right? So, like, I could be wrong, I could be asleep, my self-conception of myself could be incorrect about everything that has to do with physical features about my body. That's not something I have an immediate knowledge of, right? I have immediate, like, not immediate, but mediated by something, namely my sensory perceptual apparatus, right? And then my senses could get it wrong. Like, I could be on a bunch of mushrooms or LSD or whatever and see my body totally differently than how it really is. And that proves that I don't have an immediate relationship to those facts about myself. Those things about myself can change, but the fact that I'm a thinking thing, Descartes believes, will never change, right? And so Descartes thinks, like, death, well, all that happens is that your soul gets separated from your body, right? Yeah, your body stops moving, your soul goes somewhere else, presumably heaven, right? And you continue to think and reason and so on, right? Okay, so Descartes thinks that the cogito reveals a deep fundamental truth about the universe. That there are two distinct classes of things or aspects, and that human beings are an amalgamation of the two of them, right? So me as Penelope, right, I have aspects of myself that are thinking and aspects of myself that are extended, right? So all the things that I think, right, and do and so on that are actions of mine, things that I will and judge and so on, those are aspects of Penelope that are thinking, whereas aspects of my body, like how long are your fingernails, or what does your hair look like, or things like that, those are aspects of myself that are extended. One thing that is interesting to note, right? So we've said that the essence of bodies is that they're extended. And the previous way that we thought about this is that they take up a determinate amount of space. This is an important feature of Descartes' account. But the next consequence that you have from the essence of bodies, right, that they take up space, is that they are amenable to a mathematical treatment, right? So, like this pen, for example, Descartes says the essence of this pen is that it takes up space. If it takes up space, right, then I can measure that space, right? I can measure its length, I can compare it to other objects, right? I can I can describe what happens whenever it gains velocity and is in motion, and so on, right? And so Descartes thinks, aha, right? My dualism not only reveals a fundamental truth about the nature of the universe, as I proved in my cogito argument, but even better, right? This distinction lets me keep all of the theological stuff I want, right? The existence of the soul, human freedom, right? All of those kinds of things, while also explaining in rigorous and precise detail why it is that the essence of a body is amenable to the sort of treatment that it receives in physics and other natural sciences. And we're going to talk about this more next week with our guest lecturer as we cover more Descartes as well as some additional reception of Descartes' thinking, right? Okay, so these are the two kinds of substances, right? And so these two kinds of substances have different faculties or ways that we come to know about them. I apologize for the glare here. The faculty for the mind is reason, and the faculty for understanding the body is imagination, right? And again, importantly, imagination. What Descartes means here is our ability to see an image of something or a picture, right? He has in mind, you can imagine or, kind of picture in some respect sounds and smells and so on as well. So it's not limited to purely visual stuff, although Descartes does think that visual sense is like our most clear and distinct sense, right? And these are two different ways of knowing things, right? Reason works through rules, right? And you can especially see that in mathematics, right? There are functions, and those functions have certain features about them, right? And that's what makes mathematical reasoning possible, and that's also why mathematical reasoning doesn't change. It's because it's based on these functional components, right? Versus the imagination is to picture something, right? To form a mental image in some way. And our capacity to do that is limited in various ways by our brain, by our eyes, by our nose, by our ears, and so on. All of these physical processes that describe exactly how and why we can see and hear and smell all of the things that we do, right? Importantly, important aspect of Descartes' account here is that we can give an account of why it is that we can why, like, our hearing, for example, is less powerful than a dog's. We can know that through the tools and techniques of natural science, right? So that's interesting, right? Natural science can't really explain how we reason, but they can explain features of our mental representations. And it's very interesting to think about this now, with contemporary developments in cognitive science and especially neuroscience. Okay, and so this leads us to our third row, the status of this knowledge. Now, knowledge that we get from reason is clear and distinct. What Descartes means by that clear is that we know what it's about, right? And distinct is that we can distinguish it from other things, right? So, like, we have a clear idea that I have hair, right? But we don't have a very distinct idea about how many hairs are on my head, for example, right? The rules, or the knowledge that we receive from reason, has the characteristic of being clear and distinct because it proceeds from rules that are clear and distinct. And so those rules can communicate their clarity and distinctness as long as we continue to form a chain with them, right? Whereas things that we imagine, our empirical knowledge of the world, is by its very nature provisional and contingent, right? It's always subject to change. I can always get a further study that will undermine the results that I received so far, and I can provide an alternative hypothesis or explanation for that phenomenon, right? And normally, it's perfectly fine to get by on provisional knowledge, on contingent knowledge, right? But what Descartes is not describing how you should live your everyday life, right? Descartes is describing how in the beginning of the modern era that we can escape the confusion, right, and how lost we are essentially in medieval European thinking, right? And so that's his aim. It's important that you not just think about Descartes as giving you advice about how to live your everyday life or something like that, right? But instead he's giving advice about how do we get European sciences out of the situation of essentially being pseudosciences, right? How do we guarantee that the knowledge that we have is actually legitimate? Okay, and so finally, method of investigation. Oh, let me say one more thing about clear and distinct ideas versus provisional and contingent ideas. One example that Descartes gives about the difference between these kinds of knowledge is a chiliagon, a 1,000-sided figure, right? So like we can do a triangle, that's a 3-sided figure, a square, that's a 4-sided figure, pentagon, it's a 5-sided figure, hexagon, and so on, right? And this would be me imagining all of the various shapes that are listed thereby, right? But a chiliagon, 1,000-sided figure, right? I had to go like I can't even imagine it, right? I can't even begin to draw it. It's so large that it overwhelms my ability to form a mental picture of it, right? But Descartes says you're perfectly okay doing math with it, right? You can discover rule-based mathematical knowledge about the chiliagon even if you can't imagine it, right? And this is important. What that demonstrates for Descartes is that these are two legitimately distinct kinds of knowledge. They're totally different. And when we try to, form a mental picture of like enormously large numbers or something like that, we run into shortcomings essentially in our brain's processing power. We cannot imagine something that large, right? We can't imagine galaxies, really. We just imagine like the telescope image of the galaxy and so on. But whether 10 times n, or whatever, whether an incredibly large number is divisible by 3, right, is something that you can know without ever imagining it in that respect, right? And so the chiliagon, or the 1,000-sided figure, is meant to demonstrate in a very concrete way the distinction between reason and imagination. So finally, the method of investigation in general, you're going to discover things about thinking through thinking about thinking, right? Philosophical reflection. Whereas the way that you learn about bodies is you learn about how they communicate forces, right? How they communicate motion, the fundamental forces of the universe, right? The sort of investigations that Galileo and Copernicus and Bacon and Kepler and so on are engaging in this period, right? And Descartes thinks he has ensured the legitimacy of both of these domains by showing their limits, right? Philosophical reflection can't tell me facts about how bodies interact, right? Like I can't do enough philosophy here to be able to solve problems in physics and natural science. It's just not how it works, right? It's not the data, right? Similarly, physics can never solve the fundamental problems that relate to our mind, our thinking, and fundamental metaphysical laws that underlie physical investigations. And so this is Descartes' dualism. In the next video, we're going to cover Princess Elizabeth and Anton Wilhelm Amo's skepticism about Cartesian dualism to show why it is, you know, given that we've just explained why this framework was so helpful for Descartes, what are the problems that make other people reject this kind of framework? I hope this video was helpful and that you have a great week. Bye.